Welcome back to the workshop. We are on part 2 of this large Damascus steel kitchen chopper. The last episode I had finished rough grinding it and it was ready to harden and temper, and I have accomplished that. However, we have a problem. We have some rather distinct warpage along the edge of the knife here. Now, I have to talk about this a little bit because it's not as simple to fix as you might think. Warping in a knife blade is not extremely uncommon. There are things that can minimize that, such as normalizing and equal grinding, not having irregular shapes, that kind of thing. But when you're doing Damascus steel, the chances for warpage can be greater because you're combining two different types of steels that are going to contract a little bit differently in the quench. I believe that's the main issue here because we did go through the normalizing cycles, but we ended up with warping, and now I am faced with fixing that. There's a couple different ways you can go about fixing warpage on a knife blade. Perhaps the simplest way to fix warpage on a knife blade is simply grind it out. Now this can be effective, but there are a couple things you have to have in order to do this. First of all, you have to have enough stock. Otherwise you're going to end up with dimensions that you were not originally shooting for, and depending on what you're building, that could be a problem. I believe that could be a problem in this case. Another common solution is to apply some careful heat to portions of the blade and straighten it out. This is not something you can just do with a Damascus blade like you can with a monosteel blade, because adding heat to it is going to temper parts of it out differently, and that's going to affect to some degree the final etch of the blade, so I don't want to use that method. Also, in this case, the spine of the blade is quite straight and the only warpage is down here where it's thinner. You might say, why not just leave your blade thick enough to grind off any warpage issue and just correct it that way? Well, there is that, but in this case we're dealing with 1095 high carbon steel and 15N20, neither of which are a deep hardening steel. A deep hardening steel does not require the same speed of quenching that your other steels do. In the case of 1095 and 15N20, the window of time for that steel to cool down to a certain point out of the kiln is very, very short. If you have a thicker piece of steel, the chances of that steel reaching that temperature in the needed amount of time are less. Therefore, I have ground this down to relatively thin for a rough grind in order to ensure that I'm going to get full hardness at least a good portion up the blade. So in this case, it's kind of a catch-22. I need to have the blade thin enough to harden properly, but if I had left it thicker, it would probably not warped as easily, and if it had, I would have more stock to grind off. And this is probably why some people prefer to use deep hardening steel combinations for their Damascus steel. But that's not what we're doing today. So I've decided I'm going to reheat treat this. Now there is a window of time out of the quench, if you do it properly, to manipulate the steel a little bit, and I did not do that in this case. I sort of banked on the fact that because of the thicker spine, it was going to be okay, but that's not where the problem ended up being. Okay, so I have the edge of this back in line pretty good, using a variety of methods, carefully using these channel locks at certain spots and then tapping on it a little bit with the hammer. I think we're good. I'm gonna go ahead and heat it up again for the quench. Hopefully this has done the trick and I can correct any potential warpage as the blade cools out of the quench. Alright, this is it. Hopefully no warping. So the key here is to get this quenched out far enough so that you actually attain hardness, full hardness, and are still able to utilize the window of time that you have to straighten it out. This is complicated with a thicker tang and or spine that's not going to quench as fast. as the rest of the knife. So you're dealing with two different dimensions and cooling rates and residual heat. So it's all a balance game, really. But it's looking pretty good. There's got a few wiggles here and there that I kind of put in with the channel locks earlier. But what I'm looking for is an axis down the center of this edge that I can grind to, allowing for enough material. That's what I'm looking for. So even though it's not 100% perfect all the way down the edge, as long as I have that leeway, that's what's important. I've continued to stay hands-on as the steel settles where it's gonna be, and I didn't do this on the first quench. I normally do, but I didn't on the first quench because I got a little overly confident in the fact that I've got a nice thick spine here. Steel still moves around a lot. Hey guys, it is the next week, and this has been fully tempered again, and we are ready to finally finish grind this. And I'm glad I went back and reheat treated it. It just makes it a lot easier to work with and trying to grind out warps, and it just wasn't worth it. Okay, let me talk you through where I'm at right now. I've just finished the rough grind, and what I've done is establish two flat planes, one on each side of the blade, so it's a full flat grind. You don't have multiple grinding planes there. It's about 20 thousandths thick at the edge here, and that's gonna leave me additional material to take off with a finer grit. I'm only at 60 grit right now. And it's gonna leave a little extra material for the edge, because that's gonna remove a little bit as well. I've established the tang, so a nice flat, light taper to the tang here all the way up through the ricasso, and that's going to facilitate the installation of a brass bolster later on after I clean up these shoulders and that kind of thing. It's nice and straight as an arrow. Really happy with that on the edge and the spine. That's not the same thing, so both are important. Let me talk about grind technique a little bit real quick. So when we're dealing with thinner blades, much of the time you will find that your steel is moving around more than you would expect. One technique that becomes very useful is understanding how to grind your blade. And so for example, let's pretend this blade was cupped like this. Now you probably think you need to grind off the high side or the bump in order to make this straight. Oftentimes the opposite is true, and the reason is because after you've tempered, you've normalized, you've hardened, you've heat treated, and you've tempered, done the rough grind, etc., and you have a little kick to your blade, oftentimes that's because the material is not in a static state at that point. And so oftentimes what you need to do is remove material from the cupped side so that there is less tension on that side, and it allows the blade to move straight. Counterintuitive, but very, very useful. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw a finish grind on this and bring it down to where we can hand sand it, and then the fun will begin. Finish grinding, done. I'm gonna start with 320 grit and hand sand this thing. Finally have this hand sanded. It's time to put this in the ferric chloride. Pretty cool. This is, I did this build a little differently. I used thicker pieces of 15N20 than I normally do, and it's you can see that. I like that contrast of material size in that billet there. So we'll have this in and out of the ferric chloride a few times, and of course cleaning off that oxide layer in between until we get it etched down to the desired depth. And then of course it's going to go in the coffee overnight to give it that nice dark contrast, and it also helps kind of protect the steel with that particular oxide layer that happens with the coffee. Hey, thanks for coming along on this build. I'm really excited to see what it looks like with some nice desert ironwood and brass bolster on there. Thanks for supporting the channel and subscribing, hitting the notifications button. Thanks for watching and have a great day.